Welcome to the Telltale Cake, where we tell tales with cake and we try to ignore the corpses under the floorboards. I'm your host, Beth. With me is my dear friend, Katie. She is a keeper of bees and a rescuer of snakes. Hi, Katie. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Beth. It's a pleasure to be here.
Always a pleasure to talk to you. So what are we reading today and why are we reading it?
We are reading Jingo by Terry Pratchett. It was published in 1997, and I like this one. It's a little bit difficult to talk about because it comes in the middle of a really long series, but Jingo talks about a lot of things that are actually very relevant in our current society, even though it came out almost 30 years ago. Policing, the nature of policing, race relations. It really poignantly outlines the growing tensions at the beginning of a war. And I don't know, I really like how it goes back and forth between comedy and tragedy. It kind of almost gives you whiplash. I'm a big fan.
I've noticed that in a lot of Terry Pratchett books, the comedy and tragedy whiplash. But before we get into it, we eat cake with our books here. And because this is kind of an allegory for tensions in the Middle East, I made a date cake following a recipe I got from Savor the Best. And unfortunately, we're not in the same physical space, so you had to make it independently. But yes, so we both got date cake, and I think it's best with a toffee sauce that I serve hot. So let's see what we think of this thing.
I don't think I've ever had a cake that so successfully kept the orange flavor.
Yeah, it's almost more orange than it is date, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. The date is more of a texture. It's really heavy, but the orange nicely sets off like the heaviness and the toffee. It's good.
I think I'm a big fan. Now, when I make this again, what I might try doing is having the amount of orange juice in this just to try to get a little bit more of the date flavor to come through. But I also really like that orange citrusy flavor.
Mm-hmm. I may have slightly underbaked it. I have that kind of dense line at the bottom that they really hate on the British baking show. So probably would have lost points there, but
every time I watch that show, I get delusions of grandeur, and then I realize I will never be able to bake like that. And I'm okay with that. Now, I'm drinking coffee with this because I always drink coffee with everything.
Absolutely, same.
Yes.
Also, it's 10 a.m. and I was up late last night, so it's a good morning for coffee and literature.
Now, I did find an interesting bag of coffee grounds at a Middle Eastern market near me. So I find this vaguely terrifying.
Oh, wow. That's pretty scary.
Yeah, so it's not just me. Like,
yeah,
you are also frightened to drink coffee from this woman. So, I mean, the taste is okay. It's not great, but it adds a flavor of horror, I think. That is a product of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which I may or may not be pronouncing correctly.
I can't really weigh in. I'm drinking a creme brulee blend from a local store here in Lansing. It's pretty good.
Excellent. All right, we have our cake, we have our coffee. Let's get into it. So first, I have a physical copy here. When we judge this book by its cover, what do we think about it?
I think that the covers of the Josh Kirby covers of the Terry Pratchett Discworld series are pretty disingenuous, actually. They are literally caricatures of the characters, which in the books themselves are incredibly complex, but Kirby makes them look like they are all kind of stereotypes of themselves. So I'm actually not a big fan of the cover, but I also think that if you did get past the cover and pick it up, it would just be another example of that kind of whiplash that we were talking about. Like, this is not what you expected. And I think that's really kind of a theme throughout the Discworld series, that nothing is quite what you expect it to be at first.
You are being so much nicer about the cover art than I was about to be.
Yeah, there's a lot. If you wanted to pick it apart, we could spend a lot of time picking it apart. It's pretty, all of the women on it are pretty offensively portrayed.
Yeah, and I spent some time going through joshkirbyart.com to see if this is just sort of an off moment series of his. And
Well, he's done 42 of them, so it's a lot of off moments.
yeah, I don't really like his art. I don't like the colors. This just seems cluttered to me. And all of them seem so cluttered. And like I said, the portrayal of women, it's like a cartoon version of Frank Frazetta, but without the fun quality that was Frank Frazetta. You've got to love Frank Frazetta art. It's so bad it's gotten good again.
That's fantastic. Yeah, with the Kirby books, I find myself often encouraging people to read the Discworld series, but I almost have to apologize for that right up front, because you look at it and you're like, oh, I don't want to get to know those people.
Yeah, just ignore the cover.
Yeah.
I tend to agree. I've got a few other of the Josh Kirby covers. I should have brought them out, but I'll put some on the screen for our viewers.
Mm-hmm.
So, all right, let's talk about this book. So we have a new island, Lesh, which rose out of the sea about equidistant between Ankh-Morpork, which is one of our main cities in the Discworld, and the nation of Klatch. And right away, both countries claim the new island. We've got a whole lot of tensions result, cultural and ethnic. And a delegation of Klatchians comes to Ankh-Morpork to discuss it. And we get a whole bunch of stereotypes, and we bring in Commander Vimes and the whimsically named 71-hour Achmed.
71-hour Ahmed has got to be my favorite one-off character in this series. He is so incisive, and he feels like a real person. And I really like the series for its pretty consistently fantasy theme. Ahmed feels like he walked in off of a random true crimes novel onto a different set and is lost. He's just fantastic. He's terrifying. I really like him. But I think in your summation there, you've skipped almost a third of the way into the book. Before we move forward, I want to point out that the first scene, when Lesh is discovered by two fishermen, one from each nation, the tension immediately begins to build. There's a lot of latent racism and xenophobia in the population already, in a way where in Ankh-Morpork, which is in this book a clear correlation with the UK, wherein in other books it is more generally the West. Pratchett really takes the time to zoom in this book to talk about his countrymen and their relationship with other cultures. You know, you get this really interesting kind of side plot with the takeout family, the Gorifs, and how at first they're just a place where people go to buy curry, and then someone throws a Molotov cocktail through their window, and it kind of radicalizes their oldest son, because he was born and raised in Ankh-Morpork, but now he realizes that there's people out there that hate him just for being Klatchian, and it's really upsetting, actually. Those paragraphs, they're very jarring because everything else is pretty light.
And there's one other scene that's kind of played for laughs early on, which is there's a crowd gathering while people stand on soapboxes and
Mhm.
generate misinformation. So it's the Ankh-Morpork Twitter feed, basically,
Yeah.
going on about how Clatchians steal stuff and they do other things, and there's a lot of racism. This is not a subtle allegory. Pratchett wants you to know what he is talking about. There's like a lot of common slurs for Arabs and people from the Middle East that are used, which I found a little jarring reading it.
You get the sense that Pratchett's heard a lot of this nastiness. I don't know if he's a reader of newspapers or if he hears these things, in his neighborhood pub, but he had a lot to say about this. He had a lot of examples. And it's the kind of thing where it sounds like stuff that he actually heard. He's not making this up. This is stuff that maybe he mined for in old news or something, if he found like a conservative news, because he utilizes Sergeant Colin and Nabi to continue to illustrate just this overt racism in Ankh-Morpork towards Clatchistan and the Clatchians, which is all of the Middle East. Any Middle Eastern person is a Clatchian in this story.
Now, I think we mentioned this was in the 90s. This was specifically written in 97. And there was a lot of anti-Arab sentiment, at least in the US. I don't know about the UK, but I would assume similarly. The Gulf War has just happened. In the US, we also had the Oklahoma City bombings, which were blamed on Muslim terrorists at first, which obviously was not the case. So there's this, obviously this is before 9/11, but this is very much a attitude of anti-Arab, like anti-Muslim xenophobia, Islamophobia. So this is very much of its time. It's still relevant today because we've still got this going on.
And it has a lot of the same themes as it does now with, their women having to be veiled and this kind of, it is almost entertaining. And I think the reason that it's played for laughs is because it is patently ridiculous. There's this line that the racist characters keep jumping between. They'll run at the first sight of our flashing steel swords, and then they're so violent, they're always looking for a fight. And Nabi just keeps increasingly pointing out that you can't have both. Are they cowards or are they violent? Like it's pretty interesting as he starts picking it apart. Yeah, pick one.
Yeah, those conversations are wonderful. I also wanted to mention briefly that I recently read a book called Jesus and John Wayne by Christine Koch-Dumas, and she talks about, again, still in the US political concept, but with the fall of the USSR in the early 90s, there wasn't really a public enemy number one for the West, such as it is, and really the Arab world starts to take the place of the USSR in this period. So this may be also what we're seeing.
I don't really know that much about the politics of the 90s in Europe, but I do know that oftentimes Canada mirrors American conservative, like the dark underside of conservatism in Canada often mirrors that in the United States. So I would imagine that probably throughout the West is pretty consistent when it comes to like ultra conservative thought. A lot of those ideas are shared.
Right. I should maybe have done more research, but I do believe that it's fair to say there's also a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment in the UK at this point.
Yeah, a lot of it's pretty directly quoted, I think.
Yes. All right. So in the book, we've got Sam Vines and the City Watch, who are kind of the stand-ins for the police, and they're trying to deal with the rising anti-Clatch sentiment. They've got angry mobs. Somebody tries to assassinate one of the Clatchian delegations, a Clatchian prince. Somebody sets fire to the embassy. One thing that really struck me here is that the way the police are portrayed here is that they are the good guys. They are the reasonable guys. They are not on the side of the aggressors. And obviously in our world, the police are not that. And that is, we do not see them as being useful or on the side of the oppressed, basically.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things going on here, because I was, as I got older, starting to realize that it could be an issue with the police being the good guy, and that can be propaganda. But the way that Pratchett got into this was his idea for guards, which is when most of these characters were introduced, was he was going to write a book about the background characters in the Errol Flynn 70s action movies. His idea was that he was going to give a voice to these poor men who have to attack the obvious main character who is swinging on the chandeliers, and just how incompetent these poor guys were. So his idea was to create characters like Nobby and Sergeant Colin, who are just completely incompetent. And then Pratchett always falls in love with his characters, and he makes them three-dimensional. And he added this, he loves to play with and subvert stereotypes. So he has the John Wayne character of Vimes, who is his main watchman, his main police officer. He turns him into a police officer, but he is the film noir. He's the man's man, but he's a drunk. And at the same time, he's got the missing prince from the country coming in from outside, and Carrot doesn't know who he is, but he just wants to be the best at anything he does, and everybody immediately loves him. He's a paladin. So he has all these interesting characters, and he does such a good job writing the first 3 books that he ends up with these people who are completely defensible. So that's the first thing. He's written good people. And now these are the police officers that he has to work with, because he's already established the cast. Wherein that's not really necessarily what we see in America. Furthermore, though, these are English police officers that don't necessarily carry guns day to day when they're out on watch. They'll pick up weapons when they're going somewhere dangerous, but they are not walking the streets armed to the teeth threatening people. They are, Vimes calls it shaking hands with doorknobs. You know, they're talking to people. They're getting the feeling of what's going on in the street, making sure everybody's okay. It's the same idea as in Simon Pegg and Nick Frost's excellent police parody movie, Hot Fuzz. Simon Pegg's character is repeatedly saying to people, official police vocab guidelines state that we need to call it the police service, not the police force. Police force is too aggressive. So I haven't been to England other than one pretty disastrous layover, but I get the feeling that their approach to police is pretty different than it is here in the States.
And yeah, it's hard to write real villains when you love all your characters, which is one of the things I actually love about Terry Pratchett in general, that he is not writing two-dimensional villains to hate.
Go ahead. Sorry. When he didn't write the Watch to be the bad guys, he wrote them to be kind of incompetent, and then over time they became more competent. He does write bad guys. There's a character in the Hogfather book that is terrifying. He's an assassin, a scholarship boy, and he has a glass eye, and he literally tries to kill Santa Claus.
That's Mr. Tea Time or Tia Time?
Yeah, Tea Time. He says no one can pronounce it, and he gets mad every time nobody can pronounce it, and he just murders people to watch them die. So he absolutely writes bad guys, but the people you would expect to be bad guys, the police officers, Death, the witches, they're all his main characters. So he's kind of subverted the societal expectation again. And that's kind of, I guess, the theme of today as I'm looking back on the series and looking at Josh Kirby's work and the tragedy and the comedy. It's all kind of about subversion of expectations, which I think is also kind of one of the main elements of British comedy.
Exactly. And now that I've said that, he does have a character in this book who is sort of two-dimensional, and that would be Lord Rust.
Oh, I hate Lord Rust, and you're supposed to. He did a good job with Lord Rust.
Yes. Again, I don't think he's evil so much as he is set in his racist ways. Well, does that make people evil? I think
He's
it's
a
probably
banal kind of evil. He's an established, lawful, nasty feudal lord who's kind of out of place in modern society. Everybody hates him. Vimes is married to Lady Sybil, who is, during this book, having a lot of thoughts about her social class and how best to be a wife to this man that she loves, but also who she is and how she was raised and how that could possibly fit with the world she's currently living in, because Terry Pratchett is not a monarchist. He doesn't like the nobility, and it's pretty obvious throughout the books that they mostly just cause trouble, like a lot of trouble, and mostly they cause trouble for Vimes because the way that Pratchett writes the police is more of a class warfare thing. The police are the common man, and a lot of the writing in America lately since the BLM movement has been about how the police protect property. But in the Terry Pratchett books, it's really nice to see them struggle with their consciences. And at one point in one of the earlier Watch books, they actually raised the barricades against the military, which is under the command of the nobility, to protect their neighborhood. And they will repeatedly come to the service of the more common citizens of Ankh-Morpork.
And speaking of Lord Rust, so there's a lot of political pressure being brought to bear, not just in mob violence on the streets, but a lot of the nobility of Ankh-Morpork are also thundering for war. Lord Rust is kind of their voice. They are all assembling their private little armies because that's a great feudal thing that they do. Vimes and Lord Rust have a wonderful argument about how the Watch is not, in fact, a police force.
Yes.
Which, thank you, Vimes.
And I think that that's one of the reasons that I thought of this book when you talked to me about things that might have relevant parallels to the modern conversation that you would find in the news today, at least among the news articles that you and I would be likely to read. Vimes repeatedly and increasingly loudly insists that he is not a soldier. He doesn't want to look like a soldier. There are whole pages devoted to him thinking about his uniform and how he's not, that the police officer in Ankh-Morpork was not built for violence. It was built to keep the peace. He has a 2-foot-long stick, not a sword. He has a stick, and he has a whole monologue about how he thinks, no, this is actually correct. You would think it would be a sword, but it's not, and it needs to not be a sword because it's not the police versus the citizenry. He's there to support the workings of the city.
I love Vimes so much as a character.
Yeah. Especially as a recovering alcoholic, because he's wrestling with his job and the identity of being a policeman while he's wrestling with trying to be a good husband, eventually a good father, no spoilers, and wrestling with his addiction to alcoholism. And that's almost always a parallel to men wrestling with their masculinity. So he's really dealing with all of it all the time.
And men who aren't dealing with their masculinity. Lord Rust.
Yeah. Who just chooses not to hear things that he doesn't want to hear.
So Lord Rust and company end up removing Lord Vetinari from power so that they can go deal with the Clatchian menace. And Vetinari is always sort of the competence porn of Discworld. He is very good at everything. He's just super great at stuff. Kind of always comes in to save the day, always running this city. Vetinari is great. I mean, which I feel odd saying because he is kind of a tyrant and a despot, but
he admits that he's a tyrant. That's his title. Yeah, he's the tyrant of the city. And I think that he's the leader that Pratchett wishes we all had. You know, he's incontestable. He couldn't be voted out if he makes the unpopular choice, which gives him the freedom to make the correct choice. I think especially in 2022, a lot of us are looking at our leader and thinking, man, I'm sure we elected you. How come you're not doing any of the stuff that you said you were going to do?
That is the problem of elected leaders.
Vetinari
and unelected leaders.
Has the breadth of ability to just say, nope, this is how it is. I'm a tyrant. And if you have a hard time with it, you can go in a jail cell, which is a terrible thing in real life. It doesn't make for good leaders, but the nice thing about fantasy is that Pratchett was able to say, like, this is what's happening in my fantasy city in order to make it work so that we can have all these other conversations without everything breaking.
And I believe there's another book in which Vetinari discusses his prisons. He does not believe in making a jail cell that he himself would not be happy spending time in, which I adore. So Vetinari leaves power, sort of, and goes to get Leonard of Kerm, who is the creator of every magic technological MacGuffin we might ever need.
Leonardo da Vinci, very clearly, and he's just got him in a closet. He's just fantastic. He's got him on ice. He's in storage. He's happy. He's given him everything he wants, but he doesn't let him out because he's too dangerous.
He sits around, he draws things, he designs things. He never thinks about any possible deadly application of any of his inventions.
In fact, he says when Vetinari points out what is clearly a war machine, itemized, labeled, with a parts list, like ready to go, he says, you could never find an artisan to build it nor a soldier to fire it because harming one's fellow man is unthinkable. Like he's so innocent. He's so pure. he just assumes the best of everyone. It's so sweet. In fact, when he attempts to when he successfully takes Colin and Nabi captive, it's a fantastic scene. It's a classic clown scene because they are all completely incompetent. Leonard at one point has Sergeant Colin hold his gun while he is taking the two of them hostage so that he can modify the gun right there in the alley as he is using it to take someone hostage. And Colin doesn't fully understand and he willingly holds it. Well, he lets Leonard upgrade.
It's so slapstick. I loved that.
And it almost, like with Sergeant Angua, it is more satisfying if you read the other books first. It still makes sense as a standalone, but these characters have been built up over 5 or so books already. So you're just so familiar with them already that it makes this scene that much more believable because it's not forced in any way. That's exactly what they would do.
And this happens because Lord Vetinari takes Leonard of Kerm and his going under the water machine, because Leonard is very bad at naming things. They kidnap Colin and Nobby Nobbs to go with them, which is hilarious. And they set out for the land of Klatch via the island of Lesh in this going under the water submarine thing, which it reminded me a lot of Magic School Bus inside an underwater volcano. Yeah. I don't know if you ever saw that.
In trying to keep going in order, if I could back up just for a second before we get into the submarine. At this point, Commander Vimes has thrown his badge down in front of Lord Rust and renounced his job in the Watch because Lord Rust has insisted that he start going around and rounding up all the Klatchians to arrest them because they are at war, and he wants the police to go basically throw all of the Klatchian residents of Ankh-Morpork into a jail cell just for being Platchian. And at this point, there's a really cool scene because Vimes basically says, absolutely not. And Rust says, well, then you're fired. Carrot, take over. And Carrot says, absolutely not. And Lord Rust says, very well, then you're fired. Sergeant Colon. And Sergeant Colon says, absolutely not. And at that point, Lord Rust doesn't know what to do because the next three people in line are Nobby and then a troll and a dwarf. And Lord Rust is incredibly racist and he will not hire either of those people. So there's just kind of a moment when the Watch stops existing because they absolutely refuse to create concentration camps or do anything that is profiling. Can you imagine if the police just refused to profile people? It's just such great fantasy. It's just so great.
I am not capable of imagining that. So fortunately, Terry Pratchett imagined it for me, so I can just read about it.
Yeah, so anyway, at that point, I think we get to the going underwater machine. And they've obviously brought Colin and Nobby along so that someone can sit on the bicycle in the submarine and power the machine.
Yeah, a few different plot arcs are happening right now.
Yes.
The other one that is sort of related to the submarine is the Clatchian delegation also leaves for Clatch. And Sergeant Angua, who is a werewolf, sneaks on aboard to stay with 71-hour Ahmed and kind of spy out things.
Yeah, she was attempting to follow him and she followed him onto a boat, which then left. And it turns out in this really chilling scene that she was made well before, which is unheard of for her. She's absolutely terrifyingly capable, and is in a relationship with Captain Carrot, who is also, they're just like the perfect Watch couple.
They are the power couple in the Watch.
They're the power couple in the Watch. And there's this terrifying moment when 71-hour Ahmed is petting her in her wolf form because she looks like his other dogs and he keeps dogs. When he comes up from behind her and he's petting her and brushing her, and then he snaps a silver collar around her throat and says, basically, welcome to my ship, Sergeant Angua, and then scene change. And it's just like, oh man. She is alone. She doesn't even have her clothes with her. There's something very deeply terrifying to have her suddenly be so mortal. I don't know. It's just a very scary scene.
Although at the same time, I have to ask, how many dogs would you have to have before you wouldn't notice you had an extra one?
Yeah, she kind of thought she was going to just sneak into the pack. And I think the thought was that she assumed that 71-hour Ahmed kept his dogs in the way that a noble Englishman would, where he has a hunting pack.
Oh, right. So he doesn't know any individuals.
Right. Or he might know like the leaders, but he's looking at a mass of dogs and he doesn't really take the time maybe to count them.
All right, so Sergeant Angua, she has been captured aboard a ship with 71-hour Achmed, and the Watch finds out about this, or the former Watch. They are now kind of turning into Vimes' private army because Vimes is a knight or something at this point. Vimes goes
Speaking
through,
of my dog, sorry.
Vimes goes through several gradations of nobility throughout the books, so I think on this one he's in a knight. And anyways, he decides from reading some old books that it is his job as a feudal knight of Ankh-Morpork to have a standing army. So he recruits the Watch, or the former Watch.
To be clear, he is now calling it that, but he's still very clear on the side of they are watchmen, they're not soldiers. For the purposes of the law, they are now filling that role officially, and it starts to get a little bit gray. But at this time, interestingly, two other things happen. The first one is that this book officially passes the Bechdel test because it spends 6 or 7 pages following Lady Sybil around, who is very discontent because Vimes is not even able to sit through a dinner with her before he leaves again. They're married, and he is so married to his job that he just has no time for her. And she's wandering around looking at portraits of her family and her ancestors and remembering how it is the job of the women in her family to kind of be the solid support system at home while the men go gallivanting off to war. And she's going through even the attics and looking at her old, kind of just grounding herself in her family lineage and thinking about who she is and who she wants to be in relationship to this man who she's in love with, which is failing the Bechdel test, but it's also very much about her more so than it is about him or how to make him happy. And she helps him move forward at this point by giving him a book of chivalry, which directs him to call up his own men, not in support necessarily of his own country, but in support of his ideals, and so that he is ready when Sergeant Angua is taken, and he has some power behind him, otherwise he would have been helpless. The other thing that happens at that time is, I lost it.
If it's important, you'll remember.
Yeah.
So now that, as you pointed out, Vimes has been sort of grounded to his power and from chivalry and has gotten his watch army, he knows that Angua has been captured. Carrot discovers this and comes back to report because Carrot always does the sensible thing, always.
Which is very frustrating for Angua. There's a lot of kind of relationship content here too with the work-life balance and everything. There's a terrifying moment when they've left in pursuit of Angua and they're just trying to get her back. They're not trying to make any kind of political move or anything. They just don't want to leave anyone behind, and they certainly don't want to stay behind and support a system that is increasingly fascist. So they leave after their sergeant and they try to get her back. It's scary because she is on this other boat, kind of choosing her form, going back and forth between human and wolf, and she's naked. She has to steal a sheet. It just feels very, again, it's a very scary scene. She's very exposed. But the men are following her, not because she's a woman, but because she's their sergeant. And Carrot at one point lets everybody else sail, and he goes down and he gets his head down, as he calls it. He's able to sleep while they're chasing his girlfriend across the high seas to rescue her. And Vimes says, "How could you sleep at a time like this?" And he says, "Well, she needs me to. I need to be at my best when we catch up to her." And it's just this incredible, like, there's a few scenes in the book that are just like, what the heck, Sergeant or Captain Carrot at this point, he's just not even a human. He's a device. And I think Pratchett just likes to, he's got this hero character, and everybody needs to be a human. He's not comfortable with a perfect person. And he takes Carrot and he makes him so perfect that he's almost creepy.
Yes, he's always does the sensible thing to a point where it's weird.
Even when it's completely inhuman.
One other thing to mention, there's a small side plot that's happening with Vimes.
That's what it was.
He has a magic BlackBerry. Yes. Back when BlackBerries were still a thing, which I think they were in the 90s.
He's lampooning the BlackBerry.
Yes, so he has a personal demon-powered BlackBerry that he's never really figured out how to use, and he's kind of scared to throw it away because Lady Sybil will find out because it was a gift from her. So they're having relationship issues. But he's been complaining to this BlackBerry demon that why should he have to tell the BlackBerry demon about his appointments? Why can't the demon just know about them if they're going to happen? And which will be relevant later. So when he decides to go pursue Angua, Pratchett describes it as he picks one of the legs of the trousers of time, which is one of my favorite metaphors.
It comes throughout several of the books, the concept of the trousers of time. When there's an important decision being made, you can go down one trouser leg or the other, and it changes fate. It changes everything.
And this basically gives the Blackberry demon a temporal divergence error. So it starts reporting events from the other leg of the trouser of time,
where they stayed and tried to stay in the watch and tried to kind of make small incremental changes from within. Yeah.
Yes. And spoiler alert, this does end up with the conclusion that you can't just make small changes from within the system and expect things to work out. So yeah, Vimes gets kind of constant reinforcement from seeing into the other leg at the trouser of time that he made the right choice, which is quite a privilege and a luxury, really. Most of us don't get that kind of insight.
And also he's powerful enough that his quitting abolished the police force,
Yes.
For some of us, this actually, I felt this as a public school teacher. I felt this because there's times when I think, wow, this or that political thing that's happening, they're going to make me into one of the bad guys almost. And as a lifelong Pratchett fan, you think about stuff like this, like, wow, can I stay and like save the kids that I teach? But also I'm not the superintendent of the state of Michigan,
No, you are not.
No, it's different. Anyway, yeah, that's something I like about the Discworld series is it's wacky fantasy, but it's very relevant.
Very. And speaking of relevance, Vimes going off with his small army that used to be the Watch kind of triggers Lord Rust to follow with an invasion army, because his logic, Rust's, which is not necessarily even wrong, is that the Clatchians will see this as an invasion force, but it's very small, so it can't succeed. So they'll launch their own invasion force. So we have to follow with a bigger invasion force that's real. Yeah. So he sets off with his forces and his bad tactics and his utter conviction that they will run at the first sight of Ankh-Morpork's steel.
Yeah, he says he's going to land at the strategically strongest point because the Clatchians would never expect him to. Like, he's wrapped his head too far around this. It's like when someone says, like, which of these two cups is the pebble under, and then you get that moment like in The Princess Bride where they're talking about the iocane poison, and if it's in front of me or if it's in front of you, they kind of go back and forth like that for a minute.
Which is an incredible speech that I wish I had memorized at this precise second.
Yeah. And at the same time, Sergeant Vimes has taken the ship of the man from the very first scene who was on his soapbox talking about how the Clatchians had stolen his cargo of fine silks, which he doesn't even deal in fine silks. So Vimes has gone back at this point and using his powers as the head of one of these military forces. I forget the word for it, but he's able to requisition this man's ship, and he's just almost gleefully taking advantage of him. He's having him throw things overboard. He's having him do things that are detrimental to the ship itself in order to try and keep up with this Clatchian vessel that has Sergeant Angua on it. But you kind of get this moment where, before this moment in Pulp Fiction of like the Wild West or police officers, it would have been funny because you're watching the main character kind of take advantage of his power. But in this situation, you have that same dynamic going on, but it's against this man who was riling up the public against for racist reasons. And you've got this obvious bad guy who all of a sudden is back on his other leg and having to deal with the full extent of someone else's rights as they just strip away his monetary value off of his ship. So it
And
kind of makes it okay again. You know, Pratchett's lampooning like the Wild West thing, but he's doing it in a way that's not upsetting to watch.
and also just that scene in almost every action film where the hero like steals somebody's car.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But he's done it specifically. He's built up this character for it to be okay when that happens. Because this Jenkins, he's so reprehensible. And it's whatever.
Not just that he's been stirring up the populace, he's got smuggled illegal weapons in his ship.
Yeah, he's been smuggling weapons, yeah. Which they then use.
Yes. Which maybe makes it a little morally questionable again.
Most of them were thrown overboard in order to make the ship lighter.
True. So just quick recap. So we have going across the Clatch, we've got veterinary Leonard, Cullen, and Navi Novs in a submarine. We've got 71-hour Achmed and the Clatchians and Sergeant Angua in a ship. We've got Commander Vimes, Sir Vimes, and the Watch in Jenkins' boat following the Clatchian ship. And then we've got Lord Rust's invasion force going after Vimes.
Yes. And who knows what's going on in Clatch? We're not even clear on that yet.
Anything else we want to talk about on this? Oh, we should maybe talk about the trip over, because as we get close to Lesh, there's a lot of weird phenomena that happens. Like there's a rain of various things, including cake, which I enjoyed. Underneath, in our Magic School bus visits the underwater volcano group, we have Vetinari making a lot of suspicious notes about what's going on. And also at one point, the submarine hitches a ride off the Clatchian ship using its propeller spear thing that would definitely never be used for military sinking ships. Definitely never. But it slows down the Clatchian ship and also helps Sergeant Angua to get her silver collar off.
Yes. Pratchett he's a rural Englishman. In fact, he took pride in the fact that he never visited any of the really big cities in his life. So all of his which is amazing because he writes extensively about Ankh-Morpork, but he's a big fan, being a rural Englishman, of signs and portents. And as the weather starts changing, and you'll find out why in the second half of the book, but the climate, the weather starts changing back, and it's going to make a very important thing happen in the next in the next few chapters. And I guess there aren't chapters, they're just kind of breaks. And you had pointed that out. I've been reading all of the Discworld series on my Kindle, so it wasn't as obvious to me. Like whenever there's a half-page break, I just took that to be a chapter, but it's not.
Nope. It's one of the things that makes it hard to stop reading it. The action seems kind of continuous because there are no real breaks.
Yeah, and everything is happening at once, which also I think kind of lends itself to the building wartime tension. It's kind of well thought out that way because everything is happening too fast. And as Vimes starts feeling overwhelmed, so do we.
Yeah. This is where the action really started feeling overwhelming to me with the lack of breaks, is when everyone gets to Clatch.
Yeah, there's 5 things happening at once, as well as the Vimes's timer, Vimes's watch, has a 6th thing going on, which is what would have been happening if they'd stayed.
All right, so let's go kind of in the same order as the ships were going, maybe. So starting with the submarine, we have Leonard, Vetinari, and our incompetent watchman land in Clatch. And they are wandering around in disguise. They are disguised as traveling acrobats.
Yes, they had to steal clothes when they landed in order to blend in, which shows an incredible lack of foresight, actually. But it is clear that Vetinari didn't know they were going to Clatch. He thought they were going under the island of Lesh to confirm his suspicions that the island is made of pumice, which is very light, and that there actually is a huge air bubble under Lesh. And then when they get there and confirm it, it becomes clear that they need to go straight to Clatch. There's no time to go back to Ankh-Morpork. So Vetinari's plans have been changed, and now they are stealing clothes in order to fit into a culture that at least the two watchmen don't take seriously. So they don't really know how.
Yeah, it is very funny, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And so Nobby Nobbs ends up dressing in women's clothing because that's what they have.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this interesting scene where Nobby ends up just alone with a bunch of Clatchian women because there's a lot of social situations in which Clatchian men and women do not mingle. So he ends up just hanging out. And what did you think of this scene? Because I thought it was kind of a very interesting gender commentary.
I liked it because it's been built up to this point that Nobby would like to start taking his sexuality and relationships more seriously. Nobby has been established as being almost inhumanly ugly.
Yes.
It was commented multiple times in the first and second books that he actually carries a certificate with him to prove that he's human. He went to a doctor and had him sign a sheet of paper so he can hold it up and say, look, I'm a human being. He just doesn't, he's very off-putting, something about him. I would love to see him represented in a movie, actually, because you get this sense of him as like this small, dark, slightly disfigured thing, who's got a severe cystic acne problem, multiple different skin tones all over his body. He's very patchy. He's English, he's just very patchy. So he's trying to start taking, he's trying to find himself another half, or a serious relationship. He's not just trying to get laid, he's trying to put himself in a serious relationship. And it's interesting, as he gets to know these women, they stop becoming potential mates and they become people. And it's really a cool scene because it's happening in Clash, where a lot of, the English sentiment and the American sentiment even today is that they don't treat their women like people. But that's where Nobby goes to discover that women are people. And I really like that scene.
One of the things I most love about being a woman is that my treatment might be an excuse to go invade people or fight people or lynch people, but never to actually help or listen to the women who are ostensibly the ones being helped here.
Yeah, absolutely. The women are mourning the loss of their men who they're angry at the same time. They've gone off to war, the men have, and the women, this woman that Nobby is kind of crazy about, I forget her name, but she's mourning the loss of her fiance who's gone off to war, because men always have to do that kind of thing, and the grandma character is trying to comfort her.
It's kind of a callback to Lady Sybil's reflections earlier, that the women sit around while the men go off to war.
Yeah. And I appreciate that they take the time to reflect on that, not so much as oh, what am I going to do without my man, but rather this very difficult and dangerous thing is happening. What is my place in this? What are we now?
Exactly. Do we just sit around and knit socks?
And is that actually way more difficult than anyone is giving us credit for, because we have to sit there and just not freak out.
Also, I cannot knit. And socks are kind of hard.
I don't enjoy it. I can. I did it once to check, and turns out I can. I didn't like it.
This is fair. Not a big fan either.
Barring societal breakdown, I won't do it again.
I feel like in societal breakdown, you might not need to again, because there's other things you can do in a societal breakdown.
Yeah, that's true.
You can grow food. Back to the book. It's never really specified, as I recall, what exactly Vetinari is doing, but it will all be revealed. Well,
Vetinari is never explained. Vetinari is a literary device. He's a genius. He always knows what to do next. He's the leader that Pratchett wishes existed.
He can juggle without ever having practiced because he knows.
He's an assassin. He graduated with honors, but in languages from the assassin school. So no one's ever directly sure how deadly he is, but everyone's afraid of him. Everyone does what he says immediately. He has this presence, this enviable presence. He's good at everything. And it's never explained like Vetinari is intending to this or that. You just have to watch him and see what he does.
Exactly. So Vetinari is doing something. Nabi Navs is discovering women are people. Colin is unsuccessfully trying to make stereotyped conversation with men. Maybe discovering that people aren't stereotypes.
He's turning himself into a stereotype in the process, which I also found very funny.
Yes. So that's Submarine Group. So then we have 71 Hour, Achmed and Company, and Sergeant Angua, who land in Clatch. And then what's happening with that?
71 Hour Ahmed is not a member of the ruling class in Clatch, as it turns out. He is a member of one of the tribal bands that lives in the desert, a dreg. Literally, they call them dregs. Like, how on point can you be? Maybe a little bit too on the nose. He's part of the dregs of society, which is, he's a mirror to Vimes. You know, he's got this background where he's survived in spite of his upbringing, which is very much like Vimes, who was starving as a child. There's multiple mentions in the previous books where Vimes is a small person because he couldn't get enough to eat as a child. So these two very tough, hard-bitten men coming up from the streets, you know, there's this amazing parallel. 71 Hour Ahmed is incredibly dangerous. His tribe is incredibly dangerous. The commentary in the first half of Jingo is about how the Prince Kadram, needs all of these dangerous weapons in order to pacify the dregs. And now you find your beloved main characters of the Watch having been, you know, taken prisoner by these dangerous men and dangerous women and dangerous children and dangerous goats. I mean, it goes all the way down. So Vimes and the other watchmen are following in this ship right behind 71 Hour Ahmed. Ahmed and Angua disappear into the desert, and the ship approaches shore, this very deadly, dangerous, bleak shore. And it's limping because Vimes won't let Jenkins make any good captain choices. In fact, he makes Jenkins run his ship right up, because he's not even going to take the time to get on a rowboat. He makes him dry dock the ship right up on the shore itself, where it falls over very comically, kind of goes up and then falls over. And Pratchett takes the time to narrate that because he really likes those light moments in the midst of tension.
You need the comedy.
Yeah. There's a very like Dungeons and Dragon-y feeling about it, where like you're trying to have this epic fantasy, but at the same time, you're going to take the time for those comic moments.
Now, immediately, as soon as like they get out of the comically collapsing boat, the Watch runs into the dregs. They are just right there, rising out of the desert. They are just the classic desert people, Aiel, Fremen, mysterious desert dwellers who are just good at everything in camouflage and tough fighting. They're that group.
Yeah, and this is being narrated from Vimes' perspective, who pretty quickly, he tries to take out the main dreg, assuming that if he does that, that everyone else will just like melt away, which is not what happens. Vimes is knocked unconscious, and some time takes place while he is out.
He wakes up on a camel.
Yep, tied over on the side of a camel. Looks over, if I remember correctly, my rereading stopped at about this point. I got caught up in a couple other things, but I've read this book 3 or 4 times. So as I remember, he wakes up to hear Carrot, who's been established earlier in the book, speaks Clatchian, because of course
Because
he
of course he
does.
does.
And that's the whole explanation. It's like that it's like that Peace Corps movie from the 70s. When the main character just says, well, I've got to communicate. And that's the whole explanation for learning an entire language. And Beth and I actually met in the Peace Corps, so we know how hard it is to learn a language. So it's pretty hilarious. I like that device a lot when it's just like, oh, of course, like click.
Of course.
This character speaks this language. That's just a thing. So Carrot's riding a camel. He's not tied over it. They've given him desert gear, and Carrot is being effortlessly good at being in the desert, just like he is effortlessly good at everything else.
Carrot always rolls natural 20s. That's how I think about it.
He's a paladin with really high stats that gets to reroll anything under a 10.
Yes, maybe anything under a 15.
Yeah, except for insight. You know, he's not always. There's one scene earlier in this book that I was surprised to even read, that he was ignoring Angela while she was talking because he was thinking about the case that they were working, and she was talking and he was just saying, yep. Mm-hmm. And she was like asking him, are you paying attention? And he wasn't. So that's one weakness that he has. And his punctuation. He's not a good writer.
Okay, so he does have some stats. That's good to know. Anyway, we find out that they're sort of kind of prisoners, and also sort of kind of just guests. Right. And whenever you're enjoying drag hospitality, you get 3 days of just being chill. They're not going to kill you before those 3 days are over. And this is when we learn why 71-hour Achmed is 71 hours. Because he did not wait the full 3 days. He only waited 71 hours.
And it was another one of those moments where Pratchett just inserts like a vial of real life into the soup of fantasy that he's created. And it's just very jarring, because in most books, he's talking about interspecies relationships. He's talking about how the dwarves are getting along with the humans and how the trolls are getting along with the dwarfs. In this case, he is talking about how Middle Eastern humans get along with English humans. It's just so scary, because all of a sudden you get this little side story out of our world. You know, it sounds so real that these men had come through and poisoned this village well, and a bunch of camels had been lost. And the way that Ahmed reads it off, like, it's like a list of valuable things. And then at the end of it, and he goes, oh, and 3 women and 2 children, you know, it's just tear wrenching. And because of that value lost, you know, because of that itemized monetary value of that livestock and those people, he decided to move forward with executing them after 71 hours. And it's just so like, yeah, yeah, that's understandable. It's so understandable.
Yeah, I get it. And then this is when I sort of got a little bit confused in the narratives part. There's a whole lot of fighting and battle happening between everyone and everyone else.
And in the sense of the way that Terry Pratchett writes, everyone is a 3-dimensional character. He really has a hard time writing types, except for English nobility, who he hates. So yes. He can write Lord Rust as a stereotype. Literally nobody else is one. So even the soldiers, when they come to be attacked, are people that Vimes knows. It's the Gorith boy, and it's his own butler, who yes. In the past, like, we don't know much about Willikins until this moment when he starts becoming a person. There's the cool conversation at the beginning of the book when Vimes is talking to Willikins about how Willikins is going to take the colors, and how a Willikins has never been found wanting when Ankh-Morpork calls, and how, you know, he believes he has some prowess with a carving knife and carving up turkeys. And Vimes is like, oh my God, you're going to get yourself killed. You're going to go off into battle, marching into the desert wearing red and gold and white, and you're just going to be such an obvious target. And Willikins shows up covered in blood with 20-something ears of an enemy. Like, he's just amazing. He's been keeping everyone alive. They haven't eaten in 3 days.
Because Rust did not plan well.
Russ did a terrible job. Everyone's dead except for this one platoon who Willikins has single-handedly been keeping alive. And do you have any food, please, sir? We're all pretty hungry. And it turns out that Willikins had been raised on the streets in a pretty rough gang. And this is why, even though he couldn't tell his master when he was butlering for him, but Willikins is an incredibly capable fighter.
Now, it's at this point that Sam Vimes and 71-Hour Ahmed, since they're both kind of police, they have a conversation that I actually marked and kind of wanted to read. And it's when Ahmed said, "Nothing unites people like a good war." How could you deal with someone who thought like that? Vimes asked himself. A mere murderer? Well, you had a whole range of options. He could deal with a mere murderer. You had criminals and you had policemen, and there was a sort of seesaw there which balanced out in some strange way. But if you took a man who'd sit down and decide to start a war, what in the name of seven hells could you balance him with? You'd need a policeman the size of a country. So there's this reflection about policing and how policing can only deal with small crimes, and war is too big of a crime. And I thought that was an incredibly good monologue there.
Yeah, even thinking about like what's going on today in the Ukraine and how expensive it is. I mean, it's a horrifying tragedy, but also we've spent billions and billions of dollars buying weapons for the Ukrainians, and it's crazy that we can't just arrest Putin, you know. But that would require the UN having a lot of power, which in turn would require the police having a lot of power, which isn't going to end up well, you know, but in this fantasy world, it can, you know. So I think it's this kind of cathartic concept that Pratchett could write out, like what the world should be, kind of a thing.
Yes, which brings us to our denouement, which, like a good Dickensian denouement, comes thick and fast.
Mm-hmm.
So, Vetinari shows up, and Vetinari has a surrender. Ankh-Morpork is going to surrender, and they're going to give up all claim to the island of Leshp. And in exchange, they'll get some most favored nation trade status and some other trade stuff. But it's the sort of capitulation that Russ is going to have an aneurysm about. And in fact, Russ threatens that once he gets back to Ankh-Morpork with this document, then he'll just be executed or something by the Ankh-Morpork nobles.
So yeah, to frame that a little bit, Vimes and 71-Hour Ahmed have taken camels and ridden into the center of the war negotiations at the beginning. The brass, Rust, and Prince Kadram, and everybody who's decided they're going to have a war. And there's a few scenes throughout the book where Vimes is just absolutely chilled by these conversations because it's just gentlemen playing a game, but it's a game with the lives of all of these soldiers. And all of these men are going to die because these noblemen have this feeling that the patriotic thing to do is to ride into war, but they're not going to be hurt. They can still be coldly kind of acquaintances and friends, and eventually, you know, play cricket together again after all of this. And all of these soldiers will lie dead, being covered in sand dunes, basically. So there's this growing sense of dread and horror about what the nobility really is.
Yeah, it's like in World War I, where all the combatants, the crowned heads of Europe that are fighting each other, are all cousins.
Right.
That probably we're thinking, you know, once this is over, we'll just go back to having garden parties with each other, or whatever royalty does.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So
and
they ride their camels into this camp, and Vimes doesn't even know how to stop. So he ends up riding his camel right up into the breakfast that they're having. And everyone comments on how brave he was. And actually he was terrified the whole time because he couldn't stop his camel.
Ahmed told him how to stop his camel, but it turns out he got directions for how to accelerate the camel instead.
Yes.
It's a very funny moment.
So he kind of runs himself up into this impossibility because Vimes is so tired at this point. I don't think he's slept during the entire novel so far. and he's just trying to do the right thing. He's not really thinking ahead. And he gets into this spot where he's basically says to Lord Rust and Prince Cadram, well, I'm arresting you. You're arrested. Consider yourself arrested. And there's this moment where this kind of falling feeling where he just realizes, like, I don't have the power to do this. You and what army? I think Lord Rust says, and Lord Rust has an army.
Yeah.
So it's lucky that Vetinari shows up right then, because I think we would have seen the end of Commander Vimes.
Probably. Yes. Thank you for bringing that up. So yes, Vimes arrests people. Vetinari shows up. And then Vimes and Ahmed end up actually arresting all the armies.
Mm-hmm. The brass.
Yes.
Carrot actually gets the men playing football together.
Because of course he does.
Because of course he does, yes. He's got a soccer ball, a football for you English folk out there, in his pack, and he arranges the troops and starts them playing sports.
Which is so realistic, because if world's most popular sport.
Yep.
Kick a ball around. So we've got all of the fighting has come to an end. Lesh has been surrendered. Vetinari is being threatened with being permanently removed from any kind of power and possibly executed. But the island of Lesh sinks back into the sea.
Which it apparently regularly does.
Yes.
And there's so much going on in this novel that it's really well done, because you don't really realize the degree to which it's been forecast multiple times pretty clearly on a second or third reading that it's absolutely not gonna stay up. You know, it rises and floats regularly. Yeah,
it felt so much like Magic School Bus when they were on the submarine that I kind of picked that up, but I'm going to thank Miss Frizzle for that. I'm not sure that it
well, in the first scene, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I realized it when Vetinari was taking notes inside kind of this air bubble with the sulfur smell. That really primed me for what was going to happen to the island. But yeah, you were saying
was perfect. The first clue that you get is when Vetinari actually misses the first clue right away, because he's talking to Leonard of Quirm, and he says to Leonard, have you ever heard of Lesh? And Leonard says, oh yeah, I took some sketches there some years ago, which is way before the island ever even started floating in the book. And Vetinari says, and he just keeps talking. And then at the end of that little, like, you can't call it a chapter, but at the end of that scene, Vetinari comes running back along the trapped corridor, and he says, wait, what? And then it's scene cut. So that's what he was referring to. And yeah, it foreshadows it right in the first 50 pages of the novel that this is what's going on with Lesh.
Anyway, denouement has denouement. Everybody's back where they belong. Things are getting back to normal.
Which is cool, if I may interrupt you again. I know I've been doing it a lot. There's a lot going on with this novel. It's pretty difficult to lay it out sequentially. When the boat, which is what the submarine has been shortened to at this point, lands, Lord Rust is waiting there to arrest Lord Vetinari, and he says to Vimes, do your job. And Vimes actually puts handcuffs on Lord Vetinari, which is a big moment for Terry Pratchett. The idea that you can arrest the ruler of the city is something that he reflects on extensively through his watch characters. Luckily, when he goes to stand trial, he's able to send people out to check on Lesh, because he says, I gave the Clatchians full rights to the island, which is no longer there. You know,
and in exchange, we've got all this nice trade stuff for nothing.
Exactly. And the metaphor, of course, is that a lot of times when you start a war, it turns out to have been for nothing. And
yes,
Pratchett's a little on the nose, which doesn't bother me personally. I know it does bother some people, but I find that a lot of times when you're trying to make a point, you have to be way more clear than you think you do in order to get it across. So
this is not a subtle novel.
No.
Although I did want to ask a question, which is, why do you think this is entitled Jingo?
because it is a word for someone who is a pacifist. The whole,
I did not
it's-
actually know that.
yeah, the entire novel is a justification for Pratchett's pacifism when it comes to like regional wars. He's clearly not a pure pacifist in that his novels make it clear that there are moments when the correct thing to do is to punch someone in the face. But when it comes to like raising troops and everything, he is against that.
So the time has come for us to try to rate this book on a system that I am workshopping. It's the sugar system. So the sexiness, uniqueness, gender, axiness, and readability. So sexiness. There's a lot about relationships, but they're relationships that aren't either very sexy because it's Angua and Carrot, and they have in many ways a beautiful relationship, but it's not a sexy relationship, and there's no intimate moments on screen.
It's very
which is
British. Yeah, they're very uncomfortable with. Yeah.
Which is actually, I think, an interesting take on a werewolf character, because a lot of times when we see werewolves in fiction, they are forces of unbridled sexual energy. Maybe that's just True Blood, but which is oversexed anyway. But so for us to have a werewolf character in a relationship with no intimate moments on screen, as it were, I think that's an interesting take. And then Vimes and Lady Sybil are not having the best time in their marriage. There's times when they have a very good marriage that's working well, but this book is just not one of them.
Yeah. Sybil's spending a lot of energy on being a good wife, and Vimes is spending all of his energy on being a good policeman. And it's upsetting to read, I think, at times, because she's trying so hard and he just is not there. And that gets repaired after this novel, but it looks like a failing marriage.
It really does.
I think that the sexiness of this novel, the engagement and the desire in this novel is not sexual. I think it's sociopolitical. I think it's, man, I wish people like Vetinari existed. You know, I wish that we could do those things. That's not, the things that you wish you could do are not sexual. They're world building things. You know, it's sexy to think that you could just go arrest Putin. That's hot, you know.
It is.
How cool would it be to just fix it, you know?
But overall, I'd give this 0 ripped bodices.
Oh yeah, there are no steamy scenes in this. There is a moment when Nobbs is talking to a medium in Ankh-Morpork, and he's asking about his future love life, and she reads him a lascivious scene where he's surrounded by nubile young women, and then and that's almost steamy. And then afterward, he asks Poland where Nubia is because he doesn't know the meaning of nubile. And then it turns out that it's the scene at the well where he sees women as human beings. So that actually redirects in a way that is at least feminist, but not sexy.
Uniqueness. Now, especially for novels in the 90s, this is amazingly unique. I recently started trying to read Red Mars by Kim Stanley Robinson, and right off the bat, we've got a group of Arabs who are, due to their different culture, just not fitting into the rest of Mars, and like easily instigated to violence with cultural things. And maybe it gets better, but that's as far as I've made it. And it's
conversations that Vimes has with Ahmed are cutting edge 2022 leftist intercultural conversations. I mean, even I've pursued a lot of that because I teach in inner city schools, and I want to understand what my students are going through so that I do not unwittingly hurt them. And even I learned something from 71 Hour Ahmed, a fictional Middle Eastern character who was written in the 90s. You know, he's so insightful, and he's written so well for like an old white Englishman to have written. It's amazing. He says to Vimes at one point, give us the same credit that you would give your own like nations men where we are not, you can't just, obviously you would never say that we're bad guys, but you also can't assume that we're the good guys. We're people. Like you have to be three-dimensional about it, and you have to give us the breadth to be the villain, you know.
And that's incredible. There's this wonderful moment when they're talking, and both of them blamed only their own for attempted assassination. And that's the conversation it leads to. You have to assume that other people can be everything that you are. And that includes
the leftist trap, is that we assume that like people of color are like some kind of saint, that takes away their humanity, just like assuming that, you know, they're bad people.
Yeah. And I complain about the token women in Marvel films a lot, because then the women don't have the scope to be people. They have to be like the strong female character.
Yeah. And as far as the gender is, since we've moved down to the G, I think at this point,
Yes.
As far as the gender goes, one thing that, I mean, Terry Pratchett, I think, is my favorite author, but one thing that I will absolutely criticize him for is he feels the need to physically describe the women in his books, and he doesn't do that to the men, except for Navi. For some reason, he'll take pretty low shots at the women. Like he wants us to know that they're not the pillar of beauty or whatever, but he'll kind of let the men be whatever they decide to be in your brain.
There are better Terry Pratchett novels with better representation of women.
If you're looking for feminism, yeah, there are better. Yes. Any of the witch novels are going to really soar past that Bechdel mark.
Yeah, Monstrous Regiment
barely scratches to it. Yep. Monstrous Regiment. His third novel is called Equal Rights, and it's about a young woman who accidentally ends up with a wizarding staff trying to get into the university and dealing with the wizards just laughing in her face, even though she's clearly a wizard.
And one of my favorite characters in Discworld is Susan. I think Susan is pretty fantastic.
Absolutely. She's Death's adopted daughter, and through the adoption, because he is not a human, he is a being. He's a anthropomorphic personification, which Terry Pratchett it's his own like section of people, that he's got like a tooth fairy and the hog father, which is Father Christmas, and Death, and these people all have these superpowers, you know. And Susan's gotten a lot of Death's abilities. She can speak in a terrifying way. She can walk through walls. She can stop time. But she chooses to be a school teacher, so she's kind of my mascot. Sometimes I really like Susan.
So gender, it does pass the Bechdel test, which I did not catch until you mentioned it.
Like barely. Yeah. This one barely does.
Yeah, it's not the greatest on that. But he's written other novels, so we'll forgive him on this one. At least I will.
Yeah.
Now, Axiness. Franz Kafka says that a book should be an axe for the frozen sea inside us, which is a very poetic thing to say that could mean a lot of things. But how much do you feel like this upsets your preconceived notions of the world and makes you feel differently?
I don't think that it changed my mind about anything, but I think it broadened my scope on racial relations, because it kind of like it takes that axe and then it kind of tiptoes up behind you. Like we talked about, like it's a lighthearted comedy and we're all laughing along, and then man, he brings that axe down out of nowhere and really hard. He's able to get he's able to get to places that, you know, if he were just lecturing the whole time, he wouldn't really be able to access in our minds.
And finally, we have readability, which this is a page turner. There's no chapters. It's easy to get through because there's a lot of lighthearted comedy in between the sections that are a little uncomfortable.
All of the Discworld novels are potato chip novels. They're almost young adult. They're very easy to read. They're not
like to the point where toffee sauce.
The point where literature professors make fun of them in college as like pulp fiction. They're pulp fiction. They're for the masses. They're not academic works. But even on that level, this book particularly is fast. You don't want to put it down. There's no moment where you're like, okay, I can take a break, because there's so much happening at once, layering over each other. And it's short. It's not a long book.
In a physical copy, it is 414 pages. So yeah, that's
okay,
not
so kind of a long book. I mean, for a young adult novel, it's a longish, on the longish side.
That's true. Thank you so much for joining me today. Is there anything you want to exhort our readers about?
I find myself trying to convince people to read the Discworld series a lot in my life. So we've just spent 2 hours tearing this book apart, and it's excellent. If you're into more the feminist thing, maybe check out any of the Witches books, or Equal Rights, or Monstrous Regiment. Those are all really good feminist novels. And if you're looking for more cutting edge kind of social commentary on racial equality and making multicultural society work, his last 5 books or so are all about, the goblins and the humanity, even of goblins. He takes every monster that he introduces eventually, and they become people. It's worth your time, and it's an easy read.
As we just discussed, it's an easy read.
Yeah.
Go read Discworld.